Hey everybody, Pete here. Thanks for coming and checking out my video. Today I want to talk to you about the deck that got me back to Legendary. But before we get into me playing the deck and telling you about the deck, let's break it down card by card. So I want to let you know that I try to break down my decks by siloing the cards into two categories. So it's fairly simple. You have staples, and then you have the complementary / utility cards. So staple cards will not be changed out. They will mainstay in the deck and pivotal to its effectiveness. And the complementary and utility cards can be rotated out freely to try and fit the current meta that you're facing. So let's get into it. First, we're going to get into the staple cards. Again, these are mainstays in the deck. It will not be rotated out. So first up, we have Goblin Hut. Now, my Goblin Hut is at level 7. And where do you typically place a Goblin Hut? Well, for me, it's the corners. About 99% of the time, on the rare off chance where I'm trying to throw a curveball on my opponent, or maybe trying to help preserve a victory in the last few seconds, I'll stick it in the middle of my map. But for the most part, you're just going to place it in the corners on the left or right hand side, and that's about it, really. So let's face it, you either hate this card or you love it. I personally go back and forth between the two, but in this case I love it. You know, the Goblin Hut is just as viable at level 6 when you're trying to push to Legendary as it is level 7, because the effectiveness of the Goblin Hut isn't necessarily in the damage that your goblins are outputting, but in their role as keeping your opponent's creatures at bay. So Goblin Hut traditionally is thought of a staple in spawn decks, but this deck doesn't utilize Hut in the same way as a spawn deck does. It's used to apply pressure, like I was saying, and build momentum for a counter push. You aren't trying to cycle through your deck to drop another Hut. Instead, you're using that Hut as a means to keep opponents at bay, to apply a constant, annoying stream of pressure on one lane of the map. And Hut is one of those cards that I will not drop at the beginning of the match. I know that you kind of want to just get it down there and see what happens, but the only time I'll really play it early at the very start of a match is if I have Tombstone in hand, and I'll get to Tombstone in a little bit. But having Tombstone, it makes me more comfortable in dictating the pace of the match by using them in tandem to pressure an individual lane. My opponent then has to decide whether to fight through or attack the other lane. So Tombstone is a level 7 card that I have, and typically, kind of like Goblin Hut, it's either in the left or right of center for my map. And I usually have it go left or right of center, depending on where my opponent's push is coming from. On the rare chance, maybe sometimes just to throw a curveball like with the Hut, I'll actually place it behind one of my towers. And that's usually if I'm facing something like a miner, right? Or maybe even the goblin barrels. So those are probably the only other times I would never stick it in the left or right of center. So talking about this card, don't let the stats fool you. This card is an absolute beast. Tombstone is a card that I personally always have championed, and until recent metas, Tombstone was an underutilized tower card, but it's actually been gaining popularity for good reason. For 3 mana, you get an amazing tower that can pull enemies to the center of the map, stop beasts like P.E.K.K.A., Mini P.E.K.K.A., Prince, Sparky, the list goes on, and it can buy you time in a pinch. Will the skeletons do any significant damage? No. But they will distract your opponent's minions, while your minions get in a few precious hits, slowly gaining you an advantage. Your opponent must spend more elixir on their push to beat Tombstone, or sit back and let it do its thing. Again, it must be paired with Goblin Hut for max effectiveness. The next card we're going to be talking about is a main focus of a lot of the decks that I've been building for this week, and it's Graveyard. So it's a new legendary spell, and right now it's at level 1. So placement of this is roughly 2 tiles to the left or right of the King Tower. If it's any closer, you run the risk of a skeleton going rogue and attacking the King Tower, and then that can throw off the entire pace of the game with the King Tower and regular tower attacking your minions. It just makes the battle that much more difficult. So Graveyard is an interesting but also powerful card. So thinking about it, Graveyard isn't as strong as pre-patch Poison. And you could probably even make the argument that it's not as strong as post-patch Poison because it's difficult to use on offense and defense, and the damage isn't guaranteed. But it can be more devastating if it's not kept in check. So I rigorously tested this card and came to the conclusion that it cannot and must not be used alone. Day 1, I tried using it like pre-patch Poison, and the result, it was countered every time by goblins, Valkyrie, and Barbs by themselves. And so when you're looking at this as a legendary spell, the fact that it can easily be countered by a pair or 2 of goblins, that can be a very bad trade for you. So most decks you face on your road to Arena 9 will utilize one or all of those cards that I mentioned before. So you have to be creative in your utilization of the Graveyard spell, or just be prepared to be underwhelmed. You also cannot use Graveyard once a tower is down, since their King Tower and remaining tower will mow down your skeletons before they even get a chance to swing. So when do you use Graveyard? Or when do I use Graveyard in the context of this deck? I usually wait for my opponent to overcommit to my push with Giant Skeleton and Dark Prince, then drop Graveyard on the opposite side of the map on an unguarded tower. The second time I use it is paired with a counter push. So the tower will be focused on either a Giant Skeleton, Dark Prince, or some goblins, et cetera, et cetera. And then your opponent has to make a decision to either thwart your counter push or try and hold back for your Graveyard. So it puts them in a difficult predicament. So the third time I'll use it is at the start of a game, which I don't really recommend, but if you're just absolutely itching to use it, drop an Ice Spirit. So this card works amazing with Ice Spirit, and if you drop an Ice Spirit at the start of the game and wait for your opponent's tower to engage it, then summon Graveyard. And by the time the spell is active, your Ice Spirit is hitting their tower, freezing it, and earning you an opportunity for massive damage. And the reason why it's so effective is because most opponents allow the Ice Spirit to hit their tower because they assume you're just cycling through your deck. And in some cases you are, and this is just an extra benefit from it. Now, the one thing that I do want to clarify is I'm not saying you don't use Graveyard if you've already taken down a tower or the King Tower is active. You can, but it needs to be used strictly in a supportive role. The next card I'm going to talk about is the Dark Prince. Now, my Dark Prince is level 3, which is about the floor that you're looking at to try and make a push to Legendary, I think, with your epics. And I really only place it one place, and that's right behind the Giant Skeleton's butt. So as of right now, the Dark Prince serves one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to push Giant Skeleton to a tower. It's a very powerful combo, and the Prince push, as I'll call it, can be devastating. If the enemy invests too many resources in a big slow tank, Golem, Royal Giant, or Lava Hound, I will immediately drop this combo on the opposite end of the field to put immediate pressure on their towers, and that can sometimes be enough to take it down, or at least get very close to, and by then you already have yourself a great advantage. The next card that I'll be talking about is Giant Skeleton, and the placement for this card is really anywhere. I think it's a brilliant utility card. It's gained in popularity in recent weeks for very good reason, because it can be used to soak up damage when your opponent is pushing a lane. It can halt a counter push with this giant bomb after it dies, and it can also combo with Dark Prince to rush an opponent's tower. The other thing you can use it for as a feint to threaten and gauge how your opponent reacts to lane pressure. And so you can drop this on one side of the map, see if your opponent overcommits to stopping and dealing with it, and once you have a feeling that they've spent up too much elixir, then you can counter on the other side, usually with Graveyard or maybe even Dark Prince or Skeleton Army. So those are the staples for this deck. And now we're going to be talking about the utility cards. Again, these cards can be rotated out to fit the meta, but right now they are in my deck. So the first card that we are talking about is the Skeleton Army. So my Skeleton Army is at level 4. I think it can still be effective at level 3 if you're trying to make a push to Legendary. And if you don't have a good Skeleton Army or you're just starting out, I think that some safe alternatives are Ice Wizard, if you are lucky enough to get the Legendary, Bomber, Guards, or Mini P.E.K.K.A. So the location for this card, really anywhere on top of the enemy. It's best to drop on your side of the bridge behind their tank on top of the tank's backup. It's also best used in front of cards like Hog Rider and Giant, since they don't target minions. I was really happy to see Skeleton Army get a boost last patch. I think Skeleton Army brings a solid defensive alternative to the Tombstone. It is incredibly weak against Splash, but it is a godsend against everything else. Sometimes, if you're lucky, Skeleton Army can help clear an enemy push and become its own counter push, dealing some good damage on the enemy tower. The next card that I will be talking about is Arrows. So my Arrows is at level 10, and I think you really want to work, especially with your commons, on getting them to level 10. I think that they can be effective at level 9, but level 10 is really what you're aiming to get to. And if you don't have a high level arrow, you want to look at Zap, Fireball, or Log if you're lucky enough to get the legendary spell. So the location for this, you wherever the princess is, hit it with arrows, it kills it. Minion Horde, Skeleton Army, etc. All of those are a large grouping of small minions that can be eliminated and neutralized by arrows, and that's really what you're looking to do. And it can be used as a way to get that last little bit of damage on an opponent's tower. Ice Spirit is my next utility card, and the last one that I have for this deck. My Ice Spirit is also at level 10, and some of the alternatives that you can look to use are Skeletons, Zap, Log, or Fireball. So the location for Ice Spirit is anywhere that needs freezing, either on defense to buy time or on an offensive push. And sometimes you just want to drop it to cycle through, and that's fine too. And I love Ice Spirit. Even after the nerf, Ice Spirit still performs admirable for 1 elixir. Is it a staple though? I mean, that's still very much in the air, but I like where Ice Spirit is right now. I'm not quite confident enough to say that it's always going to be a staple in this deck, but it's really close right now. We'll see what happens after this last patch and this new meta. So the final thoughts on this deck are it's a lot of fun, it's different, and it's definitely open to your interpretation. So keep checking in, try it out, play it, and as I plan to contribute as much as possible, be sure to follow me on my Twitter and here, and let me know what you think. What I'm going to try and do is every week I'm going to focus on a card. So this week's content is going to be built around the Graveyard deck. You know, let me know. Shoot me an email or a message on Twitter or even here on YouTube, and let me know what card you would like to see me play with. So I really appreciate you guys coming and checking out my channel. looking at my videos. And if you enjoy it, go ahead, give it a like, and subscribe below.